All right, we're back. Now let's move on to blocking, which there are different kinds of blocking that can occur. One of my favorite types of blocking to talk about is motivated forgetting. Sometimes we don't want to know things that we have previously encoded. Sometimes those are memories that we don't want, they're memories that we don't want to think about. And so we may be motivated to forget. The first kind of motivated forgetting was offered by Sigmund Freud, who argued that we might repress certain kinds of memories. And he focused mainly on painful or embarrassing or what we might believe to be shameful kinds of contents. We'll go ahead and place that into unconscious storage. The idea is that you would not be able to consciously access that information. It would be stored in a place where your conscious self would not have to face that information. But that information can resurface through hypnosis. Not all of us are hypnotizable, but Freud said that, for those people who are hypnotizable, we might be able to retrieve information that was previously repressed. A lot of research has gone into whether hypnosis can facilitate memory of things that have otherwise seemed to have been lost. And the research is indicating that probably not, that hypnosis doesn't really enhance memory. But I think a lot of times the I'm going to laugh at myself for a second because it sounds like I might be a Freudian apologist, but I'm not. But a lot of times the research that's been focusing on repressed, like what we would call repressed memories coming back to the surface, are looking at things like taking an adult, hypnotizing them, and then asking them to remember their third birthday or something like that. And it's usually not very successful. What you usually get is so-called memories that are really generic, what an adult thinks a 3-year-old birthday party would be like. And so that leads researchers to say, oh, the person who's hypnotized is maybe role playing or just sort of fulfilling the demands of the situation, and they don't really remember. The thing is, we're not at, when Freud's talking about it, he's not talking about accessing benign, I want to say everyday kinds of memories. I think we can all agree a birthday is an unusual day of the year, but by the time you're being tested, you've already had probably 18 to 25 of those in your life. And so it becomes sort of a routine. What Freud was talking about is, much more meaningful material. Meaningful in the sense of it may have been scary, or it might have been embarrassing, or it might have been physically painful, psychologically painful. And so it's kind of a different class of memory that we're talking about here. So um, I'm not clear exactly, honestly, on the association between the kind of tests that have been done on hypnosis and its effectiveness for retrieving the kinds of memories that Freud was talking about. But I'll just say I can say for sure, even Freud said this, that not everybody's hypnotizable. And so that might not work for everybody. Sometimes repressed information will come up through dreams. Freud was a big believer in this. He would interpret the storylines of people's dreams and tell them what it really meant and what kinds of repressed content is being revealed through these dreams. And so he had like a whole series of symbols and things and what they meant. So like if you dreamed that your teeth were falling out, that meant something about your unconscious contents. If you dreamed that you were in a public place naked, that meant something else, right? So he would interpret these symbols that were present in the dreams and not usually in a single dream. He would look at the totality of the dreams that have been occurring across the time that the person's in psychoanalysis. So not every dream is equally meaningful. Not every dream would contain enough information to give insight into what the repressed contents might be, but dreams would be an avenue for gaining access to unconscious content. And the idea for that is that he believed that when a person is asleep, their defense mechanisms are down, and so that the unconscious content could like filter up into the consciousness of the dreamer in the form of these manifest dream storylines. It would take a skilled person such as himself to interpret the latent or underlying meaning of those storylines. But that's he said one way to get at the repressed content. I thought I had another thing on the list, Freudian slips. I thought that was another. I guess I don't have that on the list. Freudian slips would be another way to get access to repressed content. Sometimes, you say one thing when you mean a mother. I mean another, right? It's like these slips of the tongue are supposed to be times when your conscious brain sort of lost its attention or something, and the unconscious was able to slip something through to give some insight into what the person really meant. Slips of the tongue are more common when people have been drinking, for example, and so you can imagine that your defense mechanisms are down when you've been drinking. You can imagine if your defense mechanisms would be down if you were really nervous, and so you were speaking off the cuff and you were nervous about something. You might let slip something that indicates what your repressed content is. Again, it would take a skilled interpreter usually to figure out what those slips really mean. Freud was so famous for them that they came to be called Freudian slips. But what a lot of modern cognitive psychologists say is this some kind of special thing that we're talking about repression? Or are we just really experiencing inadequate retrieval cues? If we provided, good, robust retrieval cues, would you pull up even painful things, or even embarrassing things, or even things you don't want to think about? Would you pull it up anyway, because you have good enough retrieval cues? And so, there's two ways to kind of interpret this argument about repression as motivated forgetting. So I'm going to give you, now we're not going to obviously be able to go through this whole thing, but I usually do this in a face-to-face class where I say, I'm going to give you a stimulus term, and then I want you to say either the first thing that comes to mind, or the second thing that comes to your mind, or the third thing that comes to mind. Remember, we talked about associates in the past, right, in previous lectures. So what I want you to do is, if I say to you, I want the second thing that comes to mind, the first thing that comes to mind, you go, okay, that was the first one. Now I need a second one. The next thing that comes to your mind, that's your second associate. So, for example, if I said, I want you to name a city in Ohio, and I want your third associate, then, assuming you know any cities in Ohio, you would go through, the first one came to mind was Cleveland, and then the second one that came to mind was Cincinnati, and then the third one that came to mind was Columbus. Don't worry, I'm not going to say anything like that, but it's a because I'd be like, I can't think of any cities in Ohio. I'm on the West Coast. So anybody who's in my same boat, you're like, I don't know any of these cities. Let's say I prompted you, think of a precious stone and write down the first one that pops into your mind. Think of a fish. Tell me the second type of fish that comes to mind, and so on. And so we could go through states and insects, type of music, all these different things, and see how you're coming up with your first, second, or third associate for each of these. Now, if you feel like playing along, you can pause me and you can go ahead and fill out the list. Okay, presumably you either said, I don't feel like playing, or you now have a complete list where you've got that prompt followed by whichever one of the associates you're supposed to produce. Okay. Now, if you played along, go ahead and fold that paper, label it Q, and then we'll come back to it later. Set it aside, don't think about it anymore. It'll come up a little bit later. If you didn't play along, try and remember that this happened. So when I refer to it, it'll make sense. All right, so now back to motivated forgetting. So we have repression. We also have retrieval inhibition. This is where I spent a lot of my effort in my PhD training, was on retrieval inhibition. And we called this the flush effect. So that's why there's a toilet there. This is where we block retrieval of information, and in my little box here I didn't elaborate enough, but we block retrieval of information that we believe is no longer needed. For some reason, we think that information was, only relevant in a particular context, and I'm not going to be in that context anymore. Or it was time sensitive and the time has passed, or something like that. Retrieval inhibition reduces the likelihood that old information that we knew previously is going to interfere with our ability to learn new information that we think is more relevant and important. I told you in a few lectures ago, a few chapters ago, that I used to waitress when I was in college, and one of my special skills was being able to keep track of who at the table had ordered which meal, which person had what kind of drink, and I wouldn't necessarily have to ask. I could just sort of, do you want to refill on that Coke? Do you want to refill on that iced tea? Like I didn't have to ask them what was in their cups. I knew just to set the, fried chicken meal in front of this person and the hamburger in front of that person. Like I already knew who was who. And then when that table cleared, I could clear out those memories and form new ones with the new party in that same table. In order to do that, I had to inhibit retrieval of what other people at that table had ordered in the past. Right? Can you imagine if I show up with fried chicken and a hamburger for people who didn't order those things, but this is what the people who were in the table before ate? I don't think that would impress my customers very well. And so you have to use some retrieval inhibition in certain circumstances in order to have, really effective memory, right? Or else you're going to have a lot of competition where old information seems just as valid or viable as new information. So retrieval inhibition makes a lot of sense. You might have that experience whenever there's a new quarter. You may at the end of a quarter, you take your final exams, and then you have sort of this feeling of clearing all that information out. Back in the olden days, we used to actually have physical books. They were these things with covers on them and pieces of paper in between, and we would pretend to read them, and we mostly didn't get through them. But we would buy them, and then we would return them at the end of the quarter and get part of our money back at the end of the quarter. And so we'd all line up at the bookstore and sell back our old books, and it was part of the ritual of sort of inhibiting retrieval of whatever you'd learned this quarter, right? You sort of cleared your mind of spring quarter so that by fall you're all ready to go again with a nice blank, mind ready to learn the new information. So I think students can relate to this idea that you don't want old information to interfere with this new information. It's really kind of silly that we feel like that because we feel like I think what we're saying to ourselves is that every class is a free, independent, and unrelated to anything else class. When in fact, there's a lot of overlap between subjects, there's a lot of overlap within your major across classes, and noticing those regularities actually makes for a much more meaningful education. But I think for most of us, I know for myself at least, I was just trying to not experience interference, right? I was just trying to make sure I only focused on what was in this class and try not to get confused between classes. So retrieval inhibition is a very powerful motivator where we don't want to have interference, and so we try and clear our memories. Another example of motivated forgetting is what's called the Pollyanna principle, where we tend to recall pleasant items before unpleasant items, right? When we're learning a list of words, if some of them have a more negative connotation for us, we may recall them later in the list. It could be because pleasant things are easier to access in our memories. That's a known fact that we have what's called rosy retrospection. That when we look back on our past, we tend to have easier access to happier memories. And we're going to talk about this in autobiographical memories, so this is related. We have an easier time of retrieving happier memories than we do of remembering painful, like physical pain is really hard to literally remember. We tend to remember all the stuff around the physical pain, but we can't actually remember the physical pain as well. We tend to remember, happy events and the neutral to negative events kind of lumped together. That's all part of this tendency to focus on the pleasant. Now, not everybody does this, especially people who have actual diagnosable depression. They tend to focus on neutral and negative at the same rate that they do positive. In fact, maybe a little bit more. And so it's actually one of the symptoms. And so for some people, not everybody who has depression, but for some people that can be a symptom. And so it's not a guarantee that people tend to remember pleasant before unpleasant, but it's a on average trend where we see this kind of emphasis on the pleasant. And so it may be an example of us being motivated to sort of forget or overlook the negativity that might be present in a set of stimuli words or in our life experiences. Now let's get to this final thought on blocking, and that's the interference theory. So I mentioned in retrieval inhibition or the flush effect that we want to avoid interference. There's two different kinds of interference that can occur in our memories. Proactive interference would be when old information interferes with new information. So what I've got is a nice old-timey phone that some of you may not have ever even had one of these landlines in your house. But let's imagine that this is representing your landline. And then let's imagine that this nice modern, I on purpose picked an old one so that I'd be always having an old-fashioned one. So we've got this, smartphone-ish kind of thing here. And so let's let this represent, actually, this might just be a flip phone. I don't even know what this old-timey phone is. My son would laugh at me and tell me what it is right now, but I am not obsessed with cell phones. So let's imagine that you've got your old house phone number and you've got that memorized, and then you got your first cell phone of your very own. It has its own number and you need to remember it. So see, this is kind of an old example because back in the olden days we would actually tell each other our cell phone numbers. I think what we do now is just trade phones and type our numbers into each other's phones. But see, you'd have to know your own number in order to do that, wouldn't you? So yeah, you have to know your number to a certain extent. So you know your new cell phone number. Proactive interference occurs when this older information interferes with your retrieval of the newer information. So you're asked, what is your phone number? And for a moment, you're like, oh, oops, that's my old house phone number. What I mean to say is this is my number, right? There's like that moment. And the newer the cell phone is, the more likely, more powerful that old home phone number will be. The longer that you have that cell phone, you'll start to get rid of that proactive interference. So proactive is when the old information is interfering with the new information. Now, retroactive is when the new information interferes with your retrieval of the old information. So once you've had that cell phone and that becomes the number that you give to people, and you're never giving people that old home phone number anymore. Maybe mom and dad are still clinging to that, but you only give people your cell phone number. And you never talk about your home phone number. It'll come to pass that when you're asked what is your home phone number, and you need to say this number that is that old, household number, the new cell phone, the newer cell phone number, the number that is the one that you always talk about, it actually inhibits your retrieval of something that you knew so well, right? You'd known it. It was so embedded. You used it all the time, but now it has been substituted by this new cell phone number instead. You may have had that experience if you've ever changed addresses. That old address, it provides proactive interference at first. And so whenever you're having to write down your new address, you write down the wrong one, and you have to say, oh gosh, that's my old address. I need to do the work, gotta scratch that out. After time though, the new address becomes more powerful and it starts to exert retroactive interference so that it actually becomes really complex. Now you're filling out some like credit application and you've lived at your new address for a year and it wants to know your addresses up to 3 years ago. And so you have to retrieve that old address and you stop for a second. Oh my gosh, I can't remember. What was that address? It's really surprising how powerful that retroactive interference can be on something that had been the known, the go-to, the thing you always said. So these are what we're talking about when we say interference theory. When we say that information might interfere, what we're talking about is either old information may proactively interfere with your access to new information, or newer information might retroactively interfere with your retrieval of older information. And really what will determine which thing will happen, the proactive or retroactive, is how, which one has been being used the most, right? Which one has become your your dominant response, your go-to response. Initially, the old number probably is going to exert proactive, but with practice, the new number will exert retroactive. So I always like to tell this little joke because I've got a hilarious sense of humor. So, you know, imagine that you've been dating somebody for a while. And when you think of, a romantic person, this is the person who you think of. This is their name pops into mind that you've spent months or years together and they're your go-to person and then you break up. And on your first foray back into the dating world, you go out on a date and you accidentally call that date by your previous romantic partner's name. Here's the joke. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, that was proactive interference. I just came off of a long relationship, but don't worry. If you and I get along and we date for long enough, you'll start to exert retroactive interference on that previous person's name, and I won't even be able to retrieve it. Oh, yes, that sounds very romantic. I think you guys should try that. I think it makes a lot of sense. Now, one of the things that we worry about as students or as people who are trying to remember something is the possibility that we may get interference. One way to get rid of retroactive interference, where the new information is going to prevent you from recalling something that you knew beforehand. One of the things that you can do to reduce interference is to sleep after you study. Get that long-term potentiation to kick in and allow those connections to form. Even connections between the new information and the old information as context for retrieving each other. So sleep can really help with that. Here's a graph from a study where they actually looked at the percentage of syllables that were recalled. So these were nonsense syllables, like I've described before, where it's got a consonant, a vowel, a consonant, and it's just a random. It's not a meaningful word. So the percentage of syllables recalled immediately versus an hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later, up to 8 hours later. In the orange bar, they were allowed to sleep after, take a nap after learning the list of CVC trigrams. And in the blue, they were kept awake before being tested. What they found is that people who slept during the intervening hour lost fewer of the words than people who stayed awake for that intervening hour. So even just taking a power nap can help to solidify those memories and make it less likely that you will experience interference. So you want to, if you can, study in the evening, sleep that night, take a test in the morning. Like that's a much better pattern than trying to stay up all night cramming. So sleep helps to reduce interference. Interference also can produce what's called response competition, where you've got two viable responses. The cue is eliciting two competing responses, and they both are appropriate for that cue. Whoops, I am going crazy and clicking all the wrong things. So the same cue would produce the same exact powerful response for two different things. So for example, have you ever heard the word okay, see now I'm experiencing because of stage fright, I guess, because I'm trying to generate this while creating a lecture. I'm trying to think of the word ginormous. That's the word I was looking for. Ginormous, it's a combination of giant and enormous, right? And it's been put together and now it's called ginormous. Part of the reason why that exists is because when trying to describe something that is large, the word giant and the word enormous would both be appropriate responses to the cue of something that's large, right? Something that's big. And so a lot of times you'll find people making spoonerisms where they kind of mix the words or truncate it together into something like ginormous. So now we all just give up and we don't try to decide what word we want to say. We don't we don't have to decide between giant and enormous anymore. We can just say ginormous, right? So we've kind of all thrown up our hands and now we just made a new word, right? Response competition happens when you have that equally powerful, either one would be fine. I don't know which one to say or do first. What, which one, and so you can, in verbal behavior, you can get a person sort of stammering as they're trying to decide which response to actually utter. Sometimes when you have a person who's faced with a circumstance and there's two physical behaviors that would be perfectly fine, they may not do either. They stand there like frozen trying to decide which of those two responses to actually do. Right? It may look like they don't know what to do, but they're like, I have to decide between two things. I'm sitting here trying to decide. That's response competition. So we can have that with our memories, right? Verbal behavior is an example of maybe retrieving memories of vocabulary, but it also can be memories like, okay, when you give me a cue of pink and I'm supposed to generate a memory that goes along with the cue pink, I may have multiple responses that are equally validly tied to pink. But in my semantic network, I've got, I could go down this path or I could go down that path. I maybe could go down a third path. And I'm trying to decide what path I want to go down. So we get a slower response a lot of the time, whether it's in the form of stammering or sort of freezing or just overall reaction time is longer as I just sit there silently trying to decide what to do. That's what can happen in the situation with a response competition. All right, hopefully I made this interference clear enough for you. Let's go ahead and take a break and we'll come back and talk about cue dependent forgetting.